So I watched the trailer for Black Narcissus, which you can watch now on Hulu. It's an FX and BBC co-production. I watched the trailer with my wife, and she asked me immediately afterwards, so why is this supposed to be entertaining? Like, what is the point of it? And, I think that more than anything, this is an atmospheric story. I think that you feel just the tension, you feel the dread, you feel the repression, and you feel the isolation that these nuns are experiencing as they try to start this school in this remote region in the Himalayas. And you sense their growing concern as gradually the indigenous population turns against them. And it's a pretty interesting story. I think that I could compare it ad nauseum with the 1947 version. I think that the 1947 film that this is not based on, this claims to be based on the 1939 novel, not on the 1947 film, but I think it takes a lot of pages from that film's playbook. I felt like it conveyed a lot of similar atmosphere and had a similar tone. And, I would argue if you're not the type of person who likes old movies, this is a great adaptation. If you do like old movies, I recommend you watch the old movie and not this adaptation because I think the old movie is, one, more historically important. It, for instance, inspired the visual style of a lot of other films you may have seen, including, but not limited to, Frozen. They listed it as an influence for their visual style. But also, I just think that it's an example of a film where I think that some of the plot lines in this film kind of sit uncomfortably in our own day and age. And it's just a little bit hard for this miniseries to come to terms with the story it has to tell, whereas I think it sits a little bit more comfortably in the 1947 film. A lot of this story has been taken by people to be about how imperialism and the British Empire needed to end, how the influence that it had needed to end because, to a certain extent, they were causing harm, and there was a level at which the people that they were trying to help were not being helped and actually were better off being left to themselves. And you see that in this story somewhat, but I would argue that this miniseries is much, much more focused on the subliminal sexual repression that is going on with these nuns. The story focuses particularly on this relationship between Sister Clodagh and Mr. Dean, played by Gemma Arterton and Alessandro Nivola, respectively. And Gemma Arterton is the lead here. I think she does quite a good job. I think that she gives a very dewy-eyed performance, and it doesn't compare too favorably, I think, with the original actress to play this role. I think that, to a certain extent, Deborah Kerr was just better cast. But I do think that she does a good job, and she does a good job as the lead, where she can come off as harsh in some scenes, but you can still see the underlying humanity in the performance. But this relationship, I think, is the defining relationship in the story. The nuns are played well throughout by different actresses, but the most noteworthy performance, I would argue, from the nuns, as in the original, is the character of Sister Ruth, portrayed by Aisling Franciosi, who gave quite an amazing performance in The Nightingale, and this performance harkens back to that performance. She's very, very fierce in unexpected ways, and you see her trying desperately to find a way to be important as Sister Clodagh, who has similarities to her, kind of tries to push her down, to put a tamp on her desires to be useful, her desires to be seen as important. And the tension between these characters, I think, kind of drives the story forward in a lot of ways. There's also this underlying tension as the main characters try to gain the trust of the community that they're in and to win souls for Christ. And, it's an interesting story. It brings a much more contemporary view of the situation than I would argue the original film did. I would argue the original film was not anti-Catholic in its essence, and neither is this story, but it does question people's right to try to force their beliefs on others. And as is the case here, it manages to convey sympathy for the nuns at the same time as questioning their methods. And, it is a complicated situation. And as I said, I feel like it sits a little bit uncomfortably in our current political climate to a certain extent. I feel that this film, it does. If someone tells you that the original film is just head and shoulders better in every regard, they're not being completely truthful, because there are some things that this miniseries has done to kind of recalibrate aspects of the original film. For instance, in the original film, a lot of the actors that are supposed to be, these characters that are from India, or Nepal rather, they have white actors playing the majority of these roles. I believe one of the original actors was an actual non-white actor. Here, they've done a lot more suitable job in the casting, and they've made a limited effort to expand the roles of these characters. But really, to a certain extent, this just comes off, as I said, it just doesn't sit that well in this day and age, because the story's focus is on the nuns. It's really not on their interactions with the locals. This story is less subtle than the 1947 film, almost without exception, in ways that are bad. I know that some people will say, well, it's good that they can show the overt sexuality that the other film only had to hint at. It's interesting because the film was considered quite controversial in 1947, but we look at it now and it's like a G or PG rated film because the sexuality is all subliminal. And here, it's not like super hardcore sexuality. I feel like it is probably less overtly sexual than you would expect given the trailer, which made this look like Game of Thrones to a certain extent. It's a lot more akin to, I would say, almost a PG-13 movie, but at the same time, it is a lot more overt than the original film. But to me, in a story about repressed nuns, I feel like the overt sexuality actually kind of detracts from the story's themes. It's, has a lot to do with how these women are feeling that they can't be true to God and admit that they have these desires. And this, this story is able to grapple with that a little bit more explicitly than that film was. In that one, it was subtextual, whereas here it's actually textual. There are scenes where Gemma Arterton's sister Clodagh has discussions about her desire very, very explicitly with Mr. Dean. And I think that the character of Alessandro Nivola, he brings a very, very reassuring masculine presence here, but in a lot of ways he is, a toxic masculine character. And you see how his inability to grapple with his experiences in the war has turned him into an alcoholic and has turned him into this person that's very, very bitter and unable to express his feelings. But he's in his, the tension between him and Sister Clodagh, they handle it a little bit differently here than they did in that film. They make it more overtly romantic, whereas in that film it was less overtly so. But to me, I feel that this is to the story's detriment. I think that this is a case where more is very, very clearly less. And I think that the original film was superior in that regard. The acting was more subtle, and I just think generally speaking, it was a stronger choice to not have any of the overt sexuality, I think, in this particular story. I'm not saying that there's no place for overt sexuality ever in a storytelling, but here I think it feels a little bit less necessary and actually to distract from the story's themes of repression. But I also have to say that there's a lack of subtlety in the way that things are explained to the audience. Everything has to be said overtly that in the original could be subtly hinted at. And this is an aspect where I feel like this version is accomplishing a lot less from an emotional perspective while it's throwing a lot more at the viewer, a lot more obvious things that are more, appealing perhaps to a modern audience. But at the same time, I feel like what is lost in doing this? I question it. Jim Broadbent and Diana Rigg, in one of her last filmed roles, are also in this, but I would describe these as kind of cameo adjacent performances. They are in the story briefly, but they don't really impact the plot significantly. They're just kind of there to add gravitas. I don't think this story has a lot of mainstream appeal. I feel like it's very much a niche story. But for me, by the time I got to halfway through the third episode, even though I knew where the story was going because I'd already seen the 1947 film, I was white knuckling my chair, and the tension was very, very significant. So I think it's worth a shot if you find the trailer intriguing, and if you haven't seen the original film and think that, or if you have seen the original film and you think that you can handle this remake, I'd say it's worth a shot. I don't think it's as strong as the original, but in many ways it's a decent effort, even if it might fall into the category of unnecessary remake. But overall, I enjoyed it. So let me know what you thought in the comments. This is a non-spoiler review, obviously, but we can discuss spoilers in the comments. Just let people know if you're going to do that. So let me know your thoughts. If you're interested in seeing other reviews on this channel, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.